2024, I think, will be fairly insane in college football. We had the Renaissance here a few years back. Remember, we had COVID in 2020, and then we finally got our sport back, and we could actually go watch it in person in 2021. We called that the Renaissance year, and it was a really good one. A lot of close games, a lot of unpredictability. I think we may have like a Renaissance 2.0 this year, although we won't be calling the tour that. So there's one spoiler alert. But I think a lot of stuff could be crazy this year. So let me give you some reasons why I feel this way. I look forward to every season. Some seasons could be more volatile than others. There's going to be a lot of playoff hysteria going into this year. My thoughts on the expanded college football playoff are well documented, but even as I pushed back on it, I said a couple of things. Number one, I said the playoff itself will be must-see TV. I never argued about that. And then the second thing is, even though someone like me believes that maybe long-term this could somewhat water down portions of the regular season, and somewhat long-term the value of what it means to be a playoff contender may not carry the weight that it does right now, that won't happen immediately. So in the immediacy, 2024, 25, probably even 26, for these first couple of years, these first 2 or 3 years, everybody who's in the playoff race will fully believe and buy into the idea that they're playing for a shot to play for a national title. Now, in March Madness, we've long since moved beyond that. If you're playing to get into the dance, a lot of you may be playing for like a 15 seed or something like that, and you know you're not going to win a national title, but it means something to make the NCAA tournament in March. Well, that's not the way college football will ever be, but in the immediacy, in the first few iterations of this thing, everybody will believe if there is a playoff spot on the line. Okay, if you've got Iowa State versus Oklahoma State late in the year, and they're playing probably with like an 8 or a 9 or a 10 seed in the balance if they could back their way in, or maybe they're playing for that auto bid and a first-round bye if they can win their conference title, everybody will believe they're playing for a shot to go compete for a national title. The reason I say in the immediacy is because I think by 3 or 4 or 5 years into this thing, we will have established some pretty well understood rules, and those rules will be, we know some of these teams don't have a shot. Now, there are some out there, bad actors in the room, who will tell you, well, it's not about winning a title, it's about the journey. This is not college basketball. It's absolutely about winning a title. If you're talking about making the playoff, it is about having a shot to reach the belt. Okay, no one enters the ladder match with a mini ladder. Everyone thinks their ladder's high enough. Now, in due time, I think that may change. But this year will be crazy because no one knows how to think about that yet. So everyone will think they're in it. That means we may have 20-plus teams mid-November legitimately thinking they got a shot to win a national championship. That's hysteria, playoff hysteria. That'll be wild. Next up, and I want to incorporate friend of the program, Jim Nagy, the director of the Senior Bowl, here for just a second. We may very well have the most collective talent we've ever seen in college football this upcoming year. And that's a very broad statement out of nowhere, but I want to take you back. I think we featured this on the show when Jim put this out a little while ago. And it's a pretty lengthy tweet, but let me just read portions of it for you if you're listening on podcast. He said, our Senior Bowl staff has been evaluating 2025 prospects since January, and it's crazy how drastically the extra COVID year and NIL have impacted draft-eligible numbers. So first thing he's saying is a bunch of dudes who already would have been gone are still here because of COVID. And number two, because of NIL, a lot of guys who would have flirted with going to the draft, i.e. Carson Beck at Georgia, you can make enough money in college where you stay in college. So he continues, so far we've been grading 25-plus prospects at most P5s or P4 schools. By comparison, pre-COVID, NFL scouts would typically write up 15 to 18 at NFL pipeline programs like Bama, 8 to 12 at most P5s, and rarely more than 3 to 5 at a G5. The workload NFL scouts are responsible for these days almost isn't feasible, simply aren't enough hours in the day. So anyway, what he's saying is you got a lot of guys that in the past would have already been off to Sunday that are not off to Sunday yet. Now, that's not concentrated just in a couple of places. So that is not evenly spread across college football, but there are several teams that will be part of that college football playoff hysteria hurricane in November that have some players on the roster that maybe in 2016 would have not been there. They would have already been gone. So I think that's got legs to it. I think the top teams all have legit questions. So this could change. You never can have a firm grasp on this, but I think when we look at the playoff odds right now to win the national title, Georgia's number one, Ohio State's number two, and then it goes Oregon, Texas, Alabama. We can pick this apart right now, and we could talk about Oregon's secondary, lack of experience in winning big games. We could talk about Georgia's interior defensive line. We could talk about Ohio State's offensive line and maybe not having a dynamic enough quarterback to win a shootout. We could talk about Texas stopping the run, and we're going to talk about them a little bit later in the show doing just that. Bama, is the competitive depth there beneath the surface? Like every one of those teams, and we can go 6 through 10 if you wanted to, I could tell you right now a weakness that could keep them from being elite. It won't keep them from being maybe the best team in their conference. It may not keep them from winning their conference or being the number one overall seed in the playoff, but what it does mean is, as we've seen before, in these years where elite teams separate, everyone knows what's waiting at the end of the line. Sometimes it's Bama, sometimes it's Georgia. Recently, that's the way it's been. Clemson was that in the mid-20 teens, but you knew as you started to watch those teams scale and elevate in October and November, you knew, man, we're playing for the Capital One Bowl. I mean, we're really playing for a nice, solid New Year's Day bowl game because there's no way that we're going and beating them. Only one or two teams could go beat them. Well, what if we don't have that kind of year? What if we have the kind of year where, yeah, you obviously have a tier one, but there's not that big a gap between tier one and tier two? And what if those tiers are a little bit larger than normal? Might we be saying in November, as that playoff hysteria hurricane starts to form here in the Gulf of college football, might we be saying, you know, I could legitimately see 8 teams win the national title? I don't remember saying that very often. And maybe we won't say it this year, but maybe we will. I also think we are due for a crazy year on the front of hot seat talk because we don't really have any right now. Now, this sport is it's pretty unforgiving when it comes to head coaches and it comes to job security. So most years, when we're sitting here in August or on the doorstep of August and the season's about to start, most of the time, we've got preview magazines coming out, or we've got lists on 247sports.com or cbssports.com, and we've got a bunch of guys that are just on the hot seat, and everyone knows their very livelihood depends on winning a certain amount of games this upcoming year. Well, who are we talking about right now? Napier's been talked about. Pittman's been talked about at Arkansas. I would contend that may be a little different situation than normal. Dave Aranda is being talked about at Baylor, but think about how relatively short the list is. Think in years past, man. Think about how that thing's normally half a dozen to 10 or 12 coaches deep, and it's just not right now. So let's just talk this through for a second. Money's never been bigger in this sport. These guys have never made more. You've never had perceptionally quicker access to turning your team around because you can just, again, theoretically, you can just go portal in guys like Dion does or do it like Lane's done it or do it like Norvell's done it and snap your fingers. There you go. You're a winner overnight. And the problem is that we've got examples, perceptionally, of that happening. And so fan bases look around and say, wait, you're making $9 million a year, but you're asking us to give you 3 years? Well, he didn't need 3 years. Well, that guy over there didn't need 3 years. So we've got this dynamic where the money's never been bigger and the means to acquire the talent's never been more plentiful. Oh, and you can pay them legally now. No one's got patience. So that's a recipe for this hot seat situation not staying quiet much longer. Question becomes, who gets the bullseye put on them this year that right now we're not even talking about? Because that will happen. That's a certainty. That's an inevitability. I just don't know where it's going to happen yet. The Saban vacuum, I think, is also real here. And this may not impact on-field who wins and loses a game very much, but this is a real thing. Nick Saban did a lot of good for college football that extended well beyond Alabama. A lot of coaches will tell you that, including coaches who competed against him and who got their brains beat in by him. They'll tell you they could always count on him if they thought they themselves could not vocalize something properly enough or in an amplified enough fashion. They knew that if Nick Saban agreed with him and he spoke about it, everyone would shut up and listen. Okay, well, to a certain extent, he'll still have that power because he'll have a powerful microphone and his voice will always be powerful, but he's not an active head coach anymore. Kirby Smart is, Steve Sarkisian is, Ryan Day is, James Franklin is. Are any of those guys Nick Saban? I'm not talking about their resume. I'm not talking about their trophy case. No one is that, maybe ever. And if they are going to be, it takes a long time to get there. I'm talking about getting the most stubborn group of people in the world, sports fans and college administrators, to shut up when they talk. Because that's what Nick Saban had the ability to do. His voice leaves the room, so who fills that void? Now, here's why this is important. It won't impact who wins the Big 12 this year. But what it does impact is it impacts the direction of the sport, because in the absence of powerful voices saying the right things, you get a lot of these much smaller voices that exist off in the shadows, kind of saying or thinking the wrong things, and then those ideas get oxygen, and then they get legs, and then the wrong hands are on the wheel, which we've had too much of in college athletics over the past 5 to 10 years especially. So I don't know who it is or if it's a collection of people, but I really hope, above and beyond their day-to-day duties of running a program, I really hope some of the guys who should take it upon themselves decide to take it upon themselves to be a little bit more front-facing when it comes to representing the sport, above and beyond just representing their program. It's not their job description and their contract per se, but I think some of these guys at the top of the mountain, because of what this sport has given them, they should feel it to be their duty to answer that call and response. That's how I've felt about that. Also, we've got committee unknowns, switching gears here, that will impact this thing very heavily. So we already mentioned the playoff hysteria hurricane that could form in November, and we've got maybe a lack of elite teams, which creates more parity at the top. Maybe. But here's a definite. We do not know how the College Football Playoff Committee is going to act. You could do like I've seen many websites do, and you could think it's as simple as, well, let's just take the way the rankings have been at the end of the season in years past and, count for the auto bids, and we will know what the committee will have done with a 12-team playoff had it existed before. I'm not so sure that that's how that would have worked, because I'm not so sure in years past if the committee knew they had 12 spots that they would have slotted 1 through 12 the same. I can think of a year, I can't remember which one it was, maybe 2019, I think, somewhere like that. It's recently. Remember one of those years Bama had, by their standard, a down year, and the committee bumped them out of the top 10. And I remember thinking to myself, I know full well what they're doing. What they're doing is they always get accused of Bama bias and being Bama homers and being in the tank for Nick Saban. So they're taking this one opportunity where they know only 4 of them make it, so it doesn't matter if we drop them to 7 or 11, and they're going to disproportionately knock Bama down so they can have a see what we told you moment down the road when they show them favoritism again. And I wasn't even against the favoritism. Most of the time I agreed with it. But what I'm saying is, had we had a 12-team playoff in that year, I think the committee would have handled Bama differently. So my point, to bring it back to the present day, is number one, how will strength of schedule be viewed here? Does the committee believe you are what your record says you are? Or does the committee believe that there could be a 9-3 in the SEC that belongs in over an 11-1 from the G5 ranks, or whatever the scenarios end up being? And number two, how do they treat conference championship game losers? This is the even bigger unknown. These are both pretty big unknowns. But I'm thinking about a situation where Ole Miss plays Texas in the SEC championship game and Ole Miss loses. Do they fall behind a team that was ranked 6th? Like if Ole Miss is 4th and they lose to Georgia in Atlanta, do they drop behind a Notre Dame team at 6 that didn't even play? Because if that is the case, then all of a sudden you've greatly de-incentivized making the conference championship game. So these are some of the ingredients, not all. I'm sure the comment section will yield a lot more for me. These are some of the ingredients that I think if we throw them in the pot this year, and a lot of them are in there, could give us a really, really insane 2024.